My name is Steve Holmes, and I have the privilege to serve the staff and the customers and our suppliers of Springfree Trampoline as the chief bouncing officer. You don't get to do that and not have a little bit of fun. As so many of you know, this is part of having some fun, which is what we do. Is called jumping into conversations, where we engage with somebody who we think has some real insight for the time, that we might gain some insights and learn some things that we can apply not only in our business, but in our life as well. And so tonight it is a great pleasure for me to have a conversation with a great friend of mine, Gary Nelson. Gary is an author. He is an educator. He is a teacher, I think, at heart. And so I think we'll see some of that teaching come out. He has been a global missional leader. And I have a great deal of respect for him. He is the author of a book. He's an author of a number of books, but this one, I don't know if I can see it because of this stupid thing. There it is. Leading in Disorienting Times. And I think we would all agree amongst our staff here that these are disorienting times. I looked up in Webster's what's disorienting, and it's pretty clear. I think we're there, which is just a sense of not knowing exactly what direction to go. And our focus tonight, I hope, will not be so much about the disorienting, but about the hope that lies ahead, the faith that we have that this too will end, and how will we navigate as we move forward. Dr. Gary Nelson, welcome to Jumping into Conversation.
It's great to be here.
Now, Gary,
I should say that this is a sign of the good friendship that you and I have. You actually committed me to this before I actually said yes. So
that is true, everybody. Gary, how are you and Carla doing in lockdown Edmonton?
We're doing fine. It's I was talking to some friends in Australia the other day, and they were panicking in Sydney because there were 2 cases, and everybody was locking down, and we have about 1,700 cases a day, and a government leader that doesn't know what to do. He wants to keep businesses open and everything like that. So it's a bit chaotic right now here. But I have my shot.
Yeah, you've had your shot, and you're down in your learning cave, as you call it, I think, or whatever you might call it. And today you told me in a brief conversation we had with Erica as we tested out our audio and video that you had some visitors.
Yes, this morning at 7 o'clock. We live on the south end of the city of Edmonton near our daughter, who has an acreage outside the city, and we live on a ravine. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, 2 moose walked through our backyard. So that was kind of fun. They were urban moose. They were urban moose, though, you could tell.
I mean, they were looking for handouts.
Yeah.
Gary, before we jump into this, I often like to, I shouldn't say often, I do start this by saying, hey, at the heart of our organization is families and kids. And we say our biggest customers, probably kids between the ages of 6 and 14, or maybe even 4 and 12, whatever. So tell us about Gary Nelson, the 10-year-old little guy.
It was a tough childhood for me and for my mother. I have to say that right up front. I spent grade 4 in the hallway most of the year and on a behavioral mod program. Grade 5 in the cloakroom of the class there, and in grade 6 I was strapped 6 times. And the principal of the school told my mother that I would amount to nothing. And one day, years later, my mother saw this principal, and she took her aside and said, "You know what my son does now?" At that point, I was a Baptist minister, and she said, "He's a Baptist minister." And I said to my mother, "Mom, I'm not sure that she would think that was kind of the epitome of actually making it." But it was not an easy childhood. I just never fit. I don't know what it was. There was just, you read my report cards, and I played a lot of sports, but that seemed to be the only thing that captured my imagination at that point. So that was Gary, my life.
Well, I'm glad that when you and I were together, we would have been in a lot of trouble, a lot of
Oh,
trouble.
I think that's true.
You know, you wrote this book, and I want to acknowledge this. You had a co-author, Peter Dickens, and Peter passed away, I think, even before the book finally got published, which from various levels of cancer, and he had really fought it hard. But share your thoughts just about Peter for a moment, because I think it's important to recognize that he was a contributor to this journey.
For years in my life in leadership, and I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but for years in my life, I just always felt like I didn't fit. Like I thought differently. I didn't seem to think in the same ways that other people thought. And one day I heard a lecture by Peter Dickens. It was basically on complexity theory and organizational kind of health. And for the first time in my life, I heard someone who actually made sense to me. And Peter and I worked together. He had cancer, and I had a publisher who wanted me to write another book. And I said, well, I don't have another book, but a friend and I might have another book. And I knew he was dying. And so I really wanted to get his material down. He had worked in the hospital sector, a couple of major projects of bringing hospitals together, and had led change in just really profound ways. And a lot of his wisdom is captured in the book Leading in Disorienting Times. But he did die shortly before the book came out, but I was so glad. It was kind of funny to edit his stuff because he was on drugs by that time. And so we would get a chapter, and he would repeat himself and he'd do all this. And I'd say, Peter, I'm trying to get the gist of this. And my wife, who's the editor mostly, she would kind of pull it all together, but you'd get run-on sentences, and then he'd repeat himself 3 or 4 times. And we had a great laugh about this. It was a beautiful time of walking with him through this time, but it was also humorous.
Well, I mean, let's talk a little bit about disorienting just for a few minutes, because I think we all acknowledge we're there, where there's a disoriented feeling, whether you're our staff in China who may not feel disoriented other than they can't leave and they can't go. And that is the same with our staff in New Zealand and Australia. And here in Canada, we're in various parts of lockdown. In the United States, we've got various levels of freedom, whether you're in Texas or restriction, whether you're maybe someplace else. And so it can't help but be disorienting. But talk about, when you wrote the book, you weren't thinking about this type of disorientation, were you?
No, but we were thinking, it was obvious that things were changing. This was 2014, and you had the sense that all the rules were kind of being turned upside down. Nations, countries didn't have the kind of power and influence that they used to have. Corporations, large corporations, were changing the scope of that kind of thing. And then old rules that we used to play by no longer seemed to work. One of the incidents that I remember, some of you may remember, in Nigeria, the 200 young girls who were kidnapped from a school. And I still remember sitting there watching as everybody kind of sent out those wonderful emails as if that was going to have some kind of influence on this group of people. And it had absolutely, I mean, it was mean. They meant well, but it was a meaningless kind of exercise. And that's when I think we began to realize that if the atmosphere was changing, if things were changing, the rules were changing, then what was the impact that had on leadership? And how does then, as change happens as quickly as it does, how do you remain nimble as a leader enough to learn how to navigate and negotiate whatever the changes are? I mean, I was the president of a university, and we had to shut down. In 2 days, all in class courses, and move immediately to an online platform. I mean, well, who would have predicted that? And luckily, we had been thinking about those kinds of areas and had built a platform and all of those things. But lots of universities just got caught because they'd been fighting about whether they were going to go online ever. And all of a sudden, the circumstances of COVID changed that whole process. So,
Well,
I mean, I think, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead. Finish.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that it was obvious that all of this was changing, and leadership needed to change, and the way we thought about strategies, and the way we thought about even focus, and how we work together. All of those things were obviously up for grabs, and you either figured a way to harness that, or you wouldn't be able to move forward.
And is that where I mean, if you think about it, in your book, you talk about the term transformative learning. Is that really where we are all today? Are we at this stage of trying to figure out how to be transformative learners?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, transformative learners have to anticipate the times that they're in, and also anticipate where we may go, but be flexible enough and grounded enough. In other words, willing enough to question their assumptions and all of those things. They have to be willing to do that, or they won't be able to navigate. They have to have a sense of, you and I've talked about this, they have to have a sense of the true north. They need to know where they want to go, but at the same time, they have a desperate need to be able to question assumptions as they change. And I think where leadership struggles and fails in this time, and this is our political leader in Alberta, he's trying to put something through a filter that no longer exists, and he can't understand why people aren't responding the way that they should be.
Well, we'll jump. I don't want to get too much into our political sense, because we could all find different avenues to fight from and talk about. But if we're going to talk a little bit about leaders and transformative learning, I want to have a little bit of fun with everybody. I am not a Star Trek fan, but in your book you talk about the Kirks and the Picards. And for those of you who aren't as old as me, Captain Kirk, he goes back a long time. Gary, talk us a little bit about those two types of leadership styles.
Yeah, it kind of dates us when we think of this, doesn't it? I grew up as a kid watching Captain Kirk, and in the book, what we do is we talk about the change in leadership between Captain Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard. And I mean, Captain Kirk was the quintessential confident alpha male CEO, where power is concentrated in that seat that he sits in. That seat is almost symbolic to that kind of power, and the organization even looks to him because he has the plan. Nobody else has the plan. He has the plan, and power and authority is granted by this position that he holds. It's his ship. If you listen to the show, it's his ship. The Enterprise is his ship. And the role that he's given is to lead in the midst of this. And he shouts commands and he pushes himself forward because it's his ship and he's the leader. And then when they moved into this new kind of era, when you start listening to Jean-Luc Picard as the captain of the Enterprise, we contrasted that with his leadership style, because if you watch it, you realize he leads by listening. He embodies this deep commitment that he and his team together, that they can solve the problem, that they're in this together. And his leadership is positioned almost like that of a fellow traveler on the journey. Like, we're in this together, we're going to get there. And when he leads, he doesn't pretend that he actually knows where he's going, but he says there's a great line in one of the shows. He says, sometimes leaders just have to step up confidently and lead, even though they don't know where they're going. And I think that kind of is you can't imagine Captain Kirk saying that. Like, he pretended that he knew, let alone being transparent enough to say that he didn't. In Picard, the emphasis then becomes the relationship. It Without the relationships, the organization isn't going to function. And trust and relationship gives Picard the right to lead. If they don't trust him, they don't have a relationship with him, then they won't grant him the power and authority. So power and authority in certain ways is earned in that particular case. So we contrasted that to the kind of style. So that means that leadership in an organization or leadership on the enterprise, that different times, different people led in the midst of whatever the show was at that particular time, or he would look to someone and actually ask their advice and bring them into the leadership task.
Now, I said I don't want to get political, but interesting enough, since I hadn't heard you give, Gary and I have not talked about the book ever, really, other than I read it in its early stages before it went to press. But we've got this problem, it seems to me, like even in society today, there's a whole group of people who desperately want a Kirk,
right?
Who are desperately looking for a Kirk, and they don't want a Picard. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to get off on politics, but I'd be interested very briefly on your thoughts on that.
Well, I think wanting Kirk is like saying, I want to get it back in the box. Wanting a Kirk, I mean, wanting that kind of leader is actually saying, I want to go back to the way it was. Without getting political, our neighbors to the south, in Canada, to the south, I mean, it's a prime example. I want to go back to the way it, make America great again, is the quintessential statement of I want a Kirk. I want someone who's going to take me back when there was no confusion. Everything was clear. Everything was right. I remember sitting with a group of Asian leaders one time, and they were arguing about the struggle of how now dual careers was such a problem. And one of them said to me, well, it was really good then. And I said to him, well, it was really good for you then, but it wasn't necessarily really good for your spouse. And there was this kind of dead silence. And
so let's transition that for a minute, because this is,
okay.
I think, where we want to go into discussing organizational change. And I want to talk a little bit about, so far we've been thinking about the Kirks and the Picards, but as you see this screen, that, and I know that there are people here who may not have the same external characteristics that some people expect of a leader. So the wonderful thing about your book is it doesn't say disorientation guide for leaders. What it says is leading in disorienting times. Who can lead?
Anybody. I mean,
but how does that happen?
Well, I do think it starts with the leader themselves being open and grounded enough and confident enough to allow others to take on the leadership task. I think that quote you've seen me use, this: when the spine of identity is weak, everything is a threat. When the spine of identity is well established, then I can dialogue with anyone. Well, I think that's a critical piece to, if you want, to the CEO. The CEO has to be grounded enough, has to be secure enough in themselves that they don't need to feel like it's all up to them, and they need to be secure enough not to want all the kudos to come to them. They need to learn how to celebrate others' wisdom, others' leadership, and they also have to be willing to give up leadership so that others can lead. I know you guys are working. So I know you guys are working through the working genius stuff. Well, I think that working genius is a prime example. It's okay. There are certain things that I'm good at. There are certain things that I have a competency about. Like there's a sweet spot, there's a competency, but then there's this other part, and this other part is really hard for me. Like, you know, this, and I have to be, I need to confirm who I am. I need to affirm who I am. I need to be aware of who other people are. And I use the word supplement. I need to be open to supplement what is my downside. Because all of us, I know, except for you, Steve, none of us have a downside. But most of us have a downside. There's a place where we're just not comfortable. And I think for me in my own leadership, I'm not a detail person. My chief of staff used to say to me, could you read to the bottom of an email sometimes, please? She would say, and I'd say, oh yeah, I need to do that. I'm not a detail person, but I've always known that I needed those kind of people around me. If I was going to be, Canadians don't like the word successful. If I was going to be effective, as a leader, I needed people around me that supplemented the places in which I was not as strong. And then I had to have the groundedness enough to be able to hand that ability over. So I'm an extrovert. Lord knows the world would be in deep trouble if it was only extroverts that led. My wife, who is perhaps one of the best leaders I know, is very much an introvert, but I watched her lead in an organizational, as she was developing a Bachelor of Education program, and I watched her develop this, and I still remember this. She took the smallest office, and I was mad at her. I said, "Why are you doing that?" And but she built community, and she built people around her, and she built strengths, and people supplemented her abilities. And it was a remarkable group of people that they brought together as they developed that BEd program. So I think that's
there's a side of me as you hear that you could go and refer to the context of servant leader, you know, somebody who's really willing to serve. I can tell you that the people you see on the screen today, I don't know what view you've got, but whatever it is, what I can tell you is they're unbelievable at leading in unique ways based on their gifts. The challenge we've got in this context of how we're working in a remote way, this is really, really hard to exercise some of those gifts, those servant gifts, those community, those, as you say, working in community or engaging in a meaningful way. I was chatting with Erica before we started tonight and said, Erica, have you had the opportunity to get into the office? And she says, well, we're kind of doing that the best we can. We're engaging with, once a week, and we're doing this. Some of our staff are fully back in office, whether it's New Zealand and Australia. Some of the US are not, and definitely here in Canada, we are not. So I don't want to get off on a tangent, but talk a little bit about how you exercise servant leadership, or example, the way you described Carla did, that you think we can do that in this crazy environment.
Well, you're going to hate the answer, but I don't know.
That's okay.
I mean, I think we're in this formational time where we're having to learn that. I think we used to think you could live in a decentralized kind of office space, but then you began to miss the conversations in the hallway that oftentimes are some of the most creative conversations. And I think this is where organizations are at their steepest learning curve. How do we create community, and how do we create creativity in a time like this? And in the in the reality that we don't have the toolkit. Now, nobody's written the book 10 easy ways to develop, community on Zoom. I mean, because as good as Zoom is, it misses something that of the informal and the being together and all of those kinds of things. So I think we're in a formational stage, and I think anybody that tells you they do know how to do that, you should probably not listen to, because I don't think we're there yet. I think we're experimenting.
So let's transition, because I was guessing you might answer the question that way. So in your book, you refer to the elephant in the room.
Right.
The elephant in the room, and you say there's 3 questions. Can we do this better?
Right.
What was the other 2? I got to remember, because do we believe improvement can happen without change? I think is another one.
Right.
So as you think through organizationally,
I think the third question is how will, if this needs to happen, how will it affect you, in the midst of that? And I think those 3 questions become key questions. If this is the way we're going to work for the next while, and I know you as an organization spend a lot of time getting together in different places and doing a lot of the informal. Well, until this pandemic is over, that's not going to happen. And so I think trying to ask the question now, I mean, obviously, the first question is a question you should ask whether you're in pandemic or not. Can we be a better organization? Is there some, I mean, if you can't ask that question, which is one of the major issues if you're at all in academics, I mean, the academic is the last person to ask that question. They think this is the way it should be, and there's no other way to do it. And if you're not willing to say, is there a better way? Can we do something different? If we do something different, will it actually make us more effective?
So let's bridge those 2 things. So let's bridge the thing we talked a moment ago, which is that various people have various gifts of which they can lead in this disorientation, and they can lean in a little bit to do it. And the importance of having conversation about change and change for the better. There's a side in fairness. Look, folks, I have no idea where this is. I remember when we first started this journey, Gary, I was doing almost daily videos at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
Because every day information was changing. And we as an organization went through a period of time where we didn't know if we'd sell a single trampoline, because we didn't know whether or not Norm would ever open again. Mm-hmm. And so what we do know, everyone, is that change is still occurring. Mm-hmm. And so given that we know, and how can we do it better? Talk a little bit about how you utilize those gifts that we've talked about, whether it's working genius or other things, in order to properly dialogue about change. How do we do that? I'm putting you on the spot. Norm, I guess my question, I'm trying to lean in a little bit to my question about where to get us into the journey of simple versus complex.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, I mean, in our book, we talk about complexity theory. And in complexity theory, they look at challenges. And so they say there are simple challenges, there are complicated challenges, and there are complex challenges. And a simple challenge is like baking bread. If you follow the formula, you do the recipe, and you do it all right, the bread turns out the way it's supposed to be. Complicated challenges are almost the same as simple, but they just have a lot more layers to. But if you follow all the formulas and all of the things, then you're able to kind of come. It's like flying a rocket ship. But complex challenges are like raising a child. there are just so many variables. And there's not a lot of rules. I mean, my daughter had their fourth child thinking that the first three were so perfect that the fourth one would be just kind of the right one. I mean, she'd be able to do the same thing with them. And the fourth one came out with an attitude like her arm was on her hip when she came out, and it's remained on her hip all through this last 10 years. And I think that the fact is, part of the leadership navigation now is trying to understand in a particular situation and being able to respond quickly, to evaluate quickly, and to move on to, if it doesn't fit, and to be willing to jettison things that no longer work in the way that they used to. Norm, I was in China a number of years ago, and I was traveling with a government official that they were making sure I was watched through the whole thing, and he had a PhD in economics from Berkeley, and it was fascinating. We had this long, and we got into these great conversations on the bus about economics, and he said, you know, you guys in North America, you really liked globalization. And I said, well, I guess that's partly true. And he said, oh no, you really liked it. And he said, until the rules changed, until you no longer had the control that you used to have. And he says, now you're not so sure. And he said, so let me give you a Chinese proverb. It's a simple one, he said. When the window is open, the cool breezes come through the window, but so do the bugs. and I've never forgotten that proverb, because it's a great illustration. We look at a strategy, we've got, okay, this is the solution. We open the window, it moves in a certain direction, but there's always bugs that are part of this. And part of the leadership task is sorting all of those things out in the midst of.
So I'm going to stay on that theme for a moment, because I've never heard that Chinese proverb. I've heard lots of others, but not that one. I'm going to say to you that every one of these people in this screen here over the last 18 months has left their windows open and allowed the breeze to come in order that they might figure out how to navigate the changes that were occurring and lead intentionally and with humility. Now, the issue is, on some of us are saying, okay, when do we close the window to let the bugs or do we keep the window open, and what lies ahead in this navigated journey, and how do we confront the bugs when they arrive?
Mm-hmm. I think part of the problem is the assumption that one of the problems with a simple challenge is that you think if you meet that challenge and you make that change, then there'll be a time of stability, right? Like, okay, now we can do this for the next 3 to 5 years. So let me be a prophet of doom. The fact is, because we live in a complex world now, because of all of the things that I've been describing, the fact is, there will never be a time, this is my prediction, there will never be a time where we will get it harnessed to such an extent that we'll be able to say, okay, this is our strategy for the next 3 to 5 years, or this is a stable state. I think you're seeing it all over the world. You're seeing it politically, you're seeing it economically, you're seeing it in all sorts of ways, that we're not going back, and the change will become change in my discipline of missiology. We talk about discontinuous change, and basically it means it's always changing. Things will always change. And I think part of the challenge today and this is probably the hardest part for some people who like the stability, is that I cannot promise you that you will ever have the stability that you maybe had once, which might have been even an illusion to what was going on around. But at least you could hold on to the illusions that you were able to. But my promise to you is that if you remain nimble, and if you're able to be personally grounded enough to find security both in each other and in oneself, that the navigation and the negotiating of this new world that's unfolding before us is going to be actually a really creative time.
Well, so you've used the term, I've heard you use it talking about imagination in that context. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh,
so,
absolutely. See, I have this belief that the opposite of hope is not lack of hope. The opposite of hope is a lack of imagination. And what I mean by that is, if I do not have the imagination that people can change, that things can change, that there is possibilities even in the midst of the chaos that I'm in, if I don't have the imagination for that, then the only thing left for me then is to become a victim. I'm a victim to all the things that are happening around us. And you see it in certain people's lives right now as they're struggling through this. I mean, if I have no imagination that things might get better, or that people can change, or we'll work this thing out in the midst of it, then ultimately I think what begins to happen is that we become a victim to whatever is happening around us, whatever changes happen. You see that in businesses that just ultimately they just stop thriving because they just don't have the imagination to think of another way of doing it.
Now, I want to be fair to some of my friends who I know are in business who have been prevented by the Kirk, or who have been prevented from showing their imagination to lead in an effective way in some of these circumstances too.
Right.
And I think one of the things that's been so great about the organization that I'm participating in with all these people is the level of imagination and creativity that has materialized from so many different people about how we meet consumers' needs in various times, whether it's with long lead times or whatever the case may be. But the imagination has continued. So to my fellow Springfree staff and team, thank you and congratulations, because it is we could have been in that different position, and so we have exercised that imagination. Let's talk a little bit about transformable leadership, because you've used the word already. There's a few characteristics that you use in the book that I think are really important to kick on. And one, you started with groundedness. You know, it seems like sometimes it's used as a catch-all phrase. Oh, get grounded. Sometimes I'm not really sure what it means. So where is that coming from for you?
Well, I mean, it's knowing who you are and not resting in the I can't become something more, but resting in the things that are who you are, how you approach life. It's the values, the ways in which you give meaning to yourself. You know, I happen to be a person of faith, so I mean, for me, my faith is something that gives me a framework of groundedness that allows me to be relatively secure. There's this interesting passage in scripture where it says, because you are loved by God, okay, they say, then do these things. Well, I mean, it was Paul's way of understanding that somehow, if I'm grounded in that personhood to Christ, that somehow I am freer to live. And actually the passage after that is all about learning how to live in diversity and things like that. So, I mean, I think, groundedness to me is being able to be confident enough that I have enough self-awareness that enables me then to lead securely. I mean,
So when you think about leading, go ahead.
well, I was going to say, let's face it. I mean, most of the challenges we have in terms of leadership are oftentimes shaped by insecure leaders. You can nod your heads.
Well, I think what's fascinating about that statement, interestingly enough, is those leaders wouldn't define themselves as insecure. So that's our experience of some of their behaviors.
Yeah.
If we extend from your groundedness, because I think it's important. So what I'm hearing you say is, in order for each of us to think about how we lead, because we're talking about leading in disorienting times, for us to lead, we need to be grounded, and we need to understand who we are. You use the term, you need to know your compass, your true north, and you need to know who you are and where you're comfortable. There's another context here, which is the idea of being transparent.
Yeah.
And sometimes transparency is confused with being vulnerable, and I'm not sure they're the same thing, to be honest. But how, I talk a little bit about your thoughts on transparency in the midst of some of this disorientation, without being creating a huge sense of fear or uncertainty.
Well, there is, whether you like it or not, though, Steve, there is a vulnerability to transparency. You make a choice of how much you are transparent. And again, that comes out of the groundedness. But in terms of transparency, it's the way, I think it's the way that you talk about yourself as a leader. It's the way you treat other people. It's your honesty. When you're asked a question and you don't know the answer to them, and don't have, I think it happens when someone asks you a question that you don't know, and you don't have the anxiety to think that you should. I don't know if you've ever experienced that in leadership, but someone asks you a question and you're thinking, oh my heavens, I've got to have the answer for this. And the anxiety's coming, well, the day that you're free of that enables you to lead transparently.
Okay, that's fair. So we just navigate this really quick. We're in a situation where I think what I've heard, I'll use the buzzwords that you've talked about: groundedness, you've talked about transparency, you've talked about sensitivity, you've talked a little bit about humble. I think I haven't heard you use the word, but sensibility. I mean, we use the term in Good to Great. Jim Collins uses that you want to hire people who are hungry, humble, and smart, and you're looking at them. So in the midst of all of this, we've got these disoriented times we've all agreed to. We know that change is going to happen. So we've all read Who Moved My Cheese. So change is going to happen. There is uncertainty. It is not predictable. And what you're saying is that if you maintain, if I'm summarizing this, if you maintain a nimble perspective, that you work in a community of people, that you collaborate, and you do it with a sense of transparency, vulnerability, sensitivity, but you do it from who you are, you can use your imagination, and there is hope.
Absolutely. I mean, I would add the other one being, and your context. I mean, I think transformative leaders are aware of they're aware of the context in which they're working within, and they keep focus on that context, as opposed to thinking broader than that. So they keep focus, if you want. But I mean, I think those are the places, and that's the change that I think there's a chapter in our book, What's Changed About Change? And I think that's what's changed about change. Change is not about changing something so then you have stability and strategy, direction. Change is about leaders leading organizations toward, I think you use the canvas, toward the value proposition that you hold, toward the vision that you have of the organization. And it helps, but you understand that people are not mechanistic. I mean, I think one of the big changes in organizations is that people are beginning to see them as ecosystems. In other words, they're kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They're kind of, what's the word? Help me.
I'm looking myself. I'm trying to.
But I mean, they're human organizations, and everybody moves at different speeds. Everybody it takes change at different speeds, and the thought that you're going to get everybody moving in the same direction at the same time, well, that might be the goal. I mean, you're part of the leadership task now is encouraging people toward that direction while understanding that people move in different ways and change happens even in the midst of that.
I'm going to jump a little bit towards the back of the book. You conclude on what I think is really, really important in the midst of our organization, which is the foundation of relationships. You know, that at the heart of all of these changes are sustainable relationships where, yes, transparency, vulnerability, sensitivity, humility, all of those things, but and yet our relationships have been under attack a little bit. The polarization that's occurring so much in society. One of the things that's really interesting for me is just navigating how this group of people you see on the screen, when we come together, how much joy they have in the relationships that have existed. And so we're seeing changes to how relationships exist in the organization. How would you encourage us with regards to maintaining those relationships?
Well, in a COVID time, it's finding the ways in which you can, not just in the large setting, but in the smaller settings, create places in which conversation can take place, in which dialogue can take place. Relationships, if relationships are as key as I think your organization believes, then in this time we're in, where we're trying to figure out how this is done in a pandemic world, I mean, it is finding ways in which those connections can continue to take place, and it's realizing what it means. Realizing, for me, it may be something different than it may be for someone else, but it's finding those relationships and nurturing those in the kinds of tools that we have at this particular time. I think you guys are probably more intentional than most organizations around this piece, but I do think that that's part of it. One of the things that John Sachs says in a recent article in the New York Times, he says, we have moved from the we to the I. And that's why we've ended up so polarized, and why we end up throwing grenades at each other. And the tragedy is those who polarize are often rump groups, they're edges. And the people in the middle who actually want to create those kinds of places, they don't want to be we and I, they want to be we. They don't want to be I. So these people in the middle are the ones that are hurting the most, I think, in the times that we're in, because they're the ones that are actually have the imagination. Okay, let's try to figure a way to do this. But if I'm polarized, either politically or ideologically or within a business, say, I want to go this way, no, I want to go this way, And we have this, I call this the muddy middle, and we don't have the muddy middle to give us balance, or even to give us openness to other ideas. Then what we end up doing is succumbing to the edges. And I think that's the tragedy right now, is that we're living in a time in which the eyes are succeeding.
Well, I mean, I think a great example of what you just described is, I don't watch the Oscars, but I did read in the Wall Street Journal, Tyler Perry's comment, which is the only thing I'm opposed to is hate. So all of you who are on the outside, if you want to talk, meet me in the middle. Let's have a conversation. So a muddy middle. Here, I want to finish just our time, and then I'll summarize, but I want to go to that Stockdale paradox, which you didn't write. It's in the book, Good to Great. I shared with you the other day that I've been struggling through it, and I shared it with our staff, which is, you must never, ever, ever confuse the need for absolute faith that you can prevail despite the constraints that you may be under, with the need for the discipline to begin confronting the brutal facts, whatever they are. I think that one of the things that I'm hopeful that we gain out of this time together, folks, is that there's been a high degree of theory. That's okay. Sometimes that's the nature of learning. But what we need to understand is that there will be, I think, there will be constraints that are coming ahead of us, whatever they may be. We don't know. There will be change that's occurring, whatever it may. I don't know, but we must be prepared, like we did so well at the beginning of this pandemic, to be able to confront the brutal facts that were facing us, so that we made really wise decisions. And we did so well. I mean, Gary, we had a position which was, generate cash, preserve cash, and be prepared to invest the cash. And we've been doing some of that investing. And so one of the things that I want to encourage our team here today, as we think through the conclusion of that Stockdale paradox, is there will be some brutal facts that are coming about in front of us that we have no idea. And if what I can share that I've heard from my good friend, Dr. Gary Nelson, and for us as an organization, as long as we each come with who we are, we come with who we are. We navigate it with a sense of leadership, using humility and transparency and sensitivity to others. I think that we will be an organization to be seriously reckoned with, because we will be able to adapt, we will be nimble, and we will be able to look at opportunities that others may not be able to champion.
And you'll be secure enough. And I think this, I believe that the organizations that will thrive, both in this time and coming out of this time, are the organizations that are honing their creativity and their imagination, so that they're not afraid of what might come, and they're not afraid of what is. Because it's our fears. Fear produces the thing that it fears. I fear that the organization is not going to succeed, and I end up closing in. I end up creating that kind of an organization. But if I believe that things can change, if I have the imagination that and the appreciation that, hey, this is actually a great time. It's helping us sort things out. It's helping us sort what might be. And if we can do it here in this present, then we're ready to be able to face whatever comes next, post-pandemic, because that will be a whole new challenge. And I think that's the exciting thing for organizations right now. I think this is the exciting thing for for higher education. It's that we're finding there's some things that we didn't know, and we can learn from. We're finding out this can be jettisoned, and you don't necessarily need to do it this way. I think as those things are nurtured in the present, and hopefully in the present, it leads, I think, into the future the same way. It enables you to face the future that way.
So can the fear of failure create imagination? Do you think people have the ability to that sense of fear of failure create the imagination about what's possible? Thank you, Don.
That's a good question. I think the answer is fear can, as long as you don't languish in it.
Yeah. What I want to say
Yeah.
is that what's wonderful here from my perspective is that we have, as an organization, not waited to when does the end. We've been navigating change. We've been continuing to invest. In order that we come out, we don't say, well, let's just go back to the way it was, that we actually come out and we're prepared to have a step change, that we're not just looking at saying, oh, we're going to sell this many. Now we're going to sell this many because of how we've done it and how we've navigated. And I see evidence of that, just folks, so you don't see it all, but I see evidence of that coming from our engineering group. I see evidence of coming from the digital side with John Howe. I see evidence of it every week when I talk to Norm. I'm seeing evidence of it from Leanne and Megan and Amy and Dom and their interactions with Mike Braddock. I'm seeing evidence of it with Sauger and his web team. I'm seeing evidence with it, our customer service teams across the globe. Look, I got to tell you, my imagination in the midst of this disorientation has never been so vibrant about what may be possible as we go forward.
Can I add to this, Stephen, that I think part of the task of leadership in this time is to become a gatherer of stories. In other words, a person who knows those things and actually tells those stories so that others who may be languishing more than other departments and other things. I think the story, the kind of poet leader, or the leader philosopher, that becomes such a crucial role in times like this. How do I help the organization see all that it's doing, even though I may be struggling in my department? It's so good to know that other parts of it are thriving at that particular time. And I think that becomes, someone once said, well, what's the greatest aspect of a CEO? And I think it's they become poets. they become the storytellers. They become the people who tell the stories of what's good about what's going on at this particular time.
Well, I will say, as we conclude our time with you, Gary, it's been a pleasure. We have lots of stories that have been navigated through this last 15 months. And so many of you could share them and put them on paper, because there have been some outstanding stories, some examples of servant leadership, some examples of transformational leadership. And so it's been a fun journey for us, Dr. Nelson. It is a pleasure. I see that there was one other question. Michael Crane, you had a question for Gary, and we're down to our last couple of minutes. And then
Michael.
Yes, Mr. Nelson, always good to see your youthful
Likewise.
smiling face.
Miss your cottage.
Yeah, quick question. You've talked about being nimble, grounded, transparent, hopeful. I think are some of the words that you've used. I'm wondering if there's any sort of, as a follow-up to that, any advice or words of wisdom around how leaders can inspire and galvanize or even rally our teams during this sort of disorienting times?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and I think it depends. Different people hear different messages, and so how one person might be motivated, as you know, is different than how another person might be motivated. But I'm very serious about this. I see it in other organizations. If you don't tell the stories, if you don't tell the stories of, oh, so and so is doing well, and this is why they're doing well, then I think it's hard to galvanize, anybody or inspire anybody, because you can get lost. You can get lost in any organization in a normal time, but in a time in which we're in now, in this pandemic, where you're shut down, or some of us are shut down and cut off and isolated. If I'm not hearing some of these other things that are happening, then I can begin to feel, again, the New York Times has had a great article talking about what people are feeling at this time, and they use the word languishing. I wrote it down because I wanted, it isn't burnout. We still have energy. We're not depressed. We don't feel hopeless. We just somehow feel aimless and joyless. And it turns out there's a name for that, and it's languishing. So if you're going to inspire, I think it's helping people move beyond that, to see beyond that, to hear the stories, and realize and hear different kinds of stories from different styles of leaders, and that help keep an organization alive and dynamic and full of life.